Thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's so weird to hear my name said correctly these days. Thank you, Grendel. My God. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. I'm just going to go right into the introduction. Silas Monroe engages multimodal practices that inspire people to elevate themselves and improve society. Monroe's design studio Polymode has designed identities and publications for exhibitions of Jacob Lawrence at MoMA, Mark Bradford at the Venice Biennale, and future commissions include Great Force for the ICA at VCU, which is actually open already, correct, right? And Willie Smith's Street Couture for the Cooper Hewitt in 2020. It's coming up in the spring. Monroe's writing appears in Slanted, The Walker Reader, and the book W.E.B. Du Bois, Data Portraits, Visualizing Black America, which he's going to talk to us about in a few minutes. He's particularly interested in the often unaddressed post-colonial relationship between design and marginalized communities. Monroe has shown in jury group works at CalArts and at RISD. He has served as a critic at CalArts, MICA, VCU, and Yale. He is an assistant professor at Otis College of Art and Design in LA, an advisor and chair emeritus at the Vermont College of Fine Arts MFA program in graphic design. He has earned a design fellowship at the Walker Art Center, been a designer in residence at North Carolina State, and was design director at Housing Works in New York City. So without further ado, here's Silas Monroe. Thank you so much.
Okay, Ramon, thank you so much for that kind introduction. That was amazing. I love you so much. Many thanks to Grendel, Priscilla, and Rob from the Letterform Archive for hosting me. I'm really excited to be here. My voice is not cooperating that well with me tonight, so I'm going to do my best. I don't know if it's the fires or the travel or what, but I may end up talking softly, but luckily I'm mic'd. I think maybe it's okay that I talk a little softly because I'm here to share some research about W.E.B. Du Bois, and it's very close to my heart. It's close to my heart because it's about design, which I love, but it's also close to my heart because it's about identity and humanity that transcends race, color, creed, gender, nationality, and sexuality. It's about using form to turn data into a kind of utopia, or at least the hope for utopia. The research I present today is collaborative, and it is the product of my contribution to W.E.B. Du Bois' Data Portraits, which Ramon mentioned. And it's a book that's edited by two women, Whitney Battle-Baptiste and Britt Russert. And they're scholars of Du Bois at UMass Amherst, where his papers are stored. There are also additional essays in the book by Mabel O. Wilson and Alden Morris, who is the foremost living Du Bois scholar. And the book's published by Princeton Architectural Press. I'm going to channel my inner RuPaul and say you can order it now on Amazon or wherever fine books are sold. Some of what I'm going to show you and the process of researching it was actually involved some darkness. So I actually have used a little what I call gallows humor to sort of help move through it. So tonight I've actually prepared a menu, and there's actually a lot to cover, so I'm going to course it out for you. I hope that's okay with you. Do I have your permission to be a little bit raw, a little bit vulnerable, and take you, yeah? Yeah? Okay. And it's going to be a journey through time and space, so it's good that you have a meal. So the amuse-bouche is the color line. The appetizer is the Negro exhibit. And I just want to give a bit of a trigger warning with the language that I'm going to use. Some of the terms that I'm going to use were appropriate at the time that they were written, largely at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, but don't always jive with like our contemporary use of language. So take that with a grain of salt, or take what you like, leave the rest, or leave. I'm fine with that. After that, there'll be an entree, which is two parts. One part is the Georgia Negro, and the second part is a series of statistical charts illustrating the condition of the descendants of former African slaves, now in residence in the United States of America. So that's a long title, so sometimes I'll refer to that second part as just a series of statistical charts. For dessert, my art and design history, and then just to wash it all down, there's a digestive, which is the contemporary impact, and we'll be talking about a few case studies, including Trace Seals, Theester Gates, and my patron saint, James Baldwin. He's in the air. So this quote, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line," is one of W.E.B. Du Bois's most famous quotes. Just a little bit about Du Bois. He's widely known to be a prolific author, renowned sociologist, fierce civil rights advocate. He was also the co-founder of the NAACP, and he was a historian of Black lives. But he's also a pioneer of data visualization, which is less widely known. This quote comes from his also most famous book called The Souls of Black Folk, which was published in 1903. And I feel like it's a quote that cuts through the intersection of race and class. And he also mentioned a few years earlier in a lecture in 1900, which is a date that we're going to start with in the talk. And it's actually a phrase that he borrowed from Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was the first to sort of write about this notion of the color line, and Du Bois was projected it onto the 20th century. And so this is a thumbnail of all of the plates. This is sort of the entree that we're going to get to a little bit later. And in 1900, Du Bois would explore this notion of the color line, both in a literal and a metaphorical way, or ways, in this contribution. These are 63 data visualizations or infographics that were installed in an exhibition at the Exposition Universelle in Paris. And it was dedicated to the progress made by African Americans since the emancipation. And then it sat inside of this exhibit that he designed with his students, both women and men of color from the Atlanta University. These are made in ink, gouache, watercolor, graphite, and sprinklings of photographic prints. And this crisp, dynamic modern graphics, to me, is a form of infographic activism. And, you know, granted, this is 19 years before the opening of the Bauhaus, right? So, ready for an appetizer? Okay, so we're going to talk about the exhibit. So, this is an image of Du Bois standing in Paris in 1900. His full name, William Edward Burgert Du Bois, he was called Webb by his friends. So just note the top hat. He had baller headgear, very stylish. He was born in 1868. This is 5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation began to free slaves in America. When he talks about himself, this is a quote, he says, "In general thought and conduct, I became quite thoroughly New England." So even though he's a man of color, he's born in Massachusetts, he's raised by his single mother and his grandma. He then goes on to be very ambitious academically. He goes to Fisk University in Tennessee, then he goes to Harvard for a second BA and a PhD in sociology, and he's the first Black man to do so. He also, before even this picture, this is all before 1900, he would have studied in Berlin, so he would be familiar with Europe. So, you know, he knows what's going on. The exhibit was not organized by Du Bois. It was actually organized by a man named Thomas Junius Calloway, who asked Du Bois to curate it. So TJ, as his friends call him, was a lawyer, educator, and he was a graduate of Fisk University, so they were classmates. And he was also the editor of The Colored American, which is a newspaper in Washington, D.C. And so he not only brought Du Bois in, but you know, for better or worse, Du Bois had to work with his frenemy, Booker T. Washington. I feel like everyone can kind of empathize with someone who's like accomplished, you know, that you collaborate with or is in your circles, but you don't necessarily see eye to eye in terms of an approach. But between the two of them, they had an immense set of understandings and connections that allowed them to create the exhibition. So basically, in TJ's petition to the government, he asked that there be this exhibition that would both sort of show industrial and imperial prowess, but also a commitment to social reform. And so that's kind of how this American Negro exhibit was framed. And it was very collective. It was the work of students and faculty from the Tuskegee Institute, Howard University, Hampton Institute, and other historically black colleges and industrial schools. So it's just interesting to see, even in the exhibit, you sort of see the tension between Booker T. Washington, who was more interested in learning by doing, and this sort of like agrarian physical labor as a way for emancipation, and then W.E.B. Du Bois, who was sort of more about this idea of education and intellect as a way to create equality, and also didn't sort of sit well with Booker T's accommodationist approach. So the work was done collaboratively. So this is not Atlanta University, it's Clemson University in Orangeburg, South Carolina. But it shows you kind of like what the workroom would have been like with the students. And they really didn't have a ton of time to put the exhibit together. By the time they were commissioned, they didn't start making the exhibit until December 28th of 1899. And the exhibit opened in April 15th, 1900. And the travel would take at least 6 weeks by ship. I know, right? That's crazy. That's super fast, right? And these are not designers. These are sociologists, students of sociology that are creating these graphics. And so there's this multiple forms of collaboration and co-creation. And when you look at the diagrams, you're going to see a lot of references to Atlanta University. And so Du Bois is very much explicit about making transparent, that it's a collective, collaborative endeavor. And there are quotes like, prepared and executed by Negro students under the direction of Atlanta University. And I think it's really important to point out that there also would be many women working on this project too. This is actually Britt and Whitney in their essay when they're sort of talking about the construction of the images. This is what they say. Black women were among the field researchers who contributed their expertise in labor to the Atlanta studies. We might further speculate on how white working class patrons touring the American Negro exhibit in Paris interpreted and made meaning of this data on their own terms. Here, both viewers of the infographics and black study participants in the US South come into view as legitimate co-producers of sociological knowledge. So there's this idea of like dialogue and meeting, both in terms of the production and also the reception of the pieces. And I just want to actually switch out of the presentation and hear from Du Bois. He's going to talk for 2 minutes and just give you a reflection of what it was like for him teaching at Atlanta University, because I think it's really important you hear from him directly about this.
In 1897, I went to Atlanta University and stayed there 13 years, making a systematic study of the American Negro, which wasn't well done because we didn't have money enough or personnel to carry it out. But nevertheless, it's fair to say that for the next 25 years, there wasn't a book published on the Negro problem that didn't have to depend upon what we were doing at Atlanta University. It was the first study of the sort. Ours was the first institution in the United States, white or black, that had any course on the history of the American Negro, or on Negro history in general. So that it was a good beginning. But while I was there, my faith in knowledge as a solution of the Negro problem was shaken. lynching was common. Before I went away from there was an average of one lynching every week for some years. And it was a terrible sort of thing. There was one case very near Atlanta in which I knew from my studies just what had happened. It was a case of a Negro peasant not receiving his wages at the end of the season. He got in a fight with his hirer and killed him and ran away. And then when they couldn't find him, they raised the altogether new issue that he had raped the man's wife, which was evidently just dragged in. Well, I had a letter which I hadn't delivered to Joel Chandler Harris, the author of the Uncle Remus tales. He was then on the Atlanta Constitution. So I took that letter and started downtown to deliver it to him and to talk to him about this situation. And on the way down, I found that this Negro, Sam Bowes, had been caught and lynched, and that in the meat market, which was on the way I had to pass, his fingers and toes were being exhibited. Well, I didn't deliver the letter. I went back to Atlanta University. And then I made up my mind that knowledge wasn't enough. That even if people were ignorant of essential matters which they had to know, they wouldn't correct their actions without more realization of just what the difficulties were. They had not only to know, but they had to act.
So I think that's a really, powerful picture of sort of what he was dealing on a daily life, and even this idea of, human flesh, displayed with meat, as an image of kind of the other, literally, but there's a history in sociological exhibits of sort of, when you go to the Natural History Museum and it's like the Neanderthal, right, and the like bird, and you're sort of setting a scene. Du Bois and his team knew they had to pick a strategy that was not that, and a lot of the innovation and the sort of early modernism that they're bringing not only to the plates but to the exhibition come from this idea of using abstraction as a tool to talk about equality. This is his Du Bois's exhibitor pass, getting to Paris, and this in that last story, the conflict between Du Bois being an educator but then also being considered less than human also connects to this the compression of time to get the plates to Paris. And in his reflection, in his writing, he says, the details of finishing these 50 or more charts in colors with accuracy was terribly difficult with little money, limited time, and not too much encouragement. I was threatened with nervous prostration before I was done and had little money left to buy passage to Paris, nor was there a cabin left for sale. But the exhibit would fail unless I was there. So at the last moment, I bought passage in the steerage and went over and installed the work. So this image of Du Bois as the intellectual, but like traveling in the hull, the graphic design actually like had, better class transport or the same transport, as he did. And it doesn't really sit comfortably with this idea of him being this intellectual that sort of is on this world stage. But when he would arrive, this is what he would see. The Eiffel Tower had been completed a couple years before. This is a stereograph of the tower. And so you're coming to this European theater at a moment of a shift between sort of the fin de silice and end of Victorian, ennui, let's get out of our dreary salons, right? Also you're sort of dealing with this neoclassical architecture. So this is the pavilion, the American Pavilion at center. This is a souvenir that would sort of show off a rise in American power in the context of these other major pavilions. So the United States would be next to France and Germany and these other kind of world powers, and it was sort of a way for them to kind of be like a debutante, sort of, emerging on the world stage. And the exhibit itself did not have an ideal positioning. It was in this little palace of social economy, which had a lot of these other like weird sociological exhibits. In fact, you can kind of see, it may be hard at this scale, but there's like Prudential Life Insurance Company has displays like down there. This is where the Negro exhibit is down here in the aisle of the palace. It's sort of like outside the exhibit, like down there. Actually, you can see like some of it was there in this corner, and then there were like 2 other rows down there. But then there's also like the American Library Association, which that's totally appropriate, right? So kind of some dry, maybe, content. So they knew that they had to create something very dynamic. So instead of relying on that diorama or tabletop model presentation often used at World's Fairs during the time, Du Bois and his team used information design as a rhetorical device. Extant photo documentation shows at least half of the present diagrams mounted in wing frames set on movable standards that allowed fairgoers to flip through large double-sided plates of the rich data at eye level. So it was interactive. And we'll look at, one of the last plates we look at, there's actually direct instructions to a user about how to interact with the plates. And again, this space was filled with all of these products of all of these students from these different colleges and industrial schools. And it was really meant to sort of lift up the Black experience. And it included images, text, framed photographic portraits of African American leaders and politicians. There were tools, harnesses, other agricultural products, and there's also a bronze statue of Frederick Douglass right there, right, the color line. And also 250 publications authored by African Americans. And one of the photo frames actually was carved by a former slave. So you have this kind of like specter of history still operating within the exhibit. And it won a gold prize and was considered an outstanding exhibit. And then the exhibition traveled back to the United States. And it was largely bourgeoisie, women and men of color who would support and finance the exhibition in various expositions. Like this is a souvenir for the Pan-African Exposition in Buffalo. And so it like would travel around the country. And here you see Du Bois and then Callaway sitting in the space. And see the same elements, but just reconfigured in different spaces. Ready for an entree? Yeah? So looking at the actual plates, they're actually divided into 2 different series. And they're distinct, but they're also highly related in certain ways. Both sets use a range of visual strategies. They include geographic maps, circle and spiral diagrams, bar and area charts, and complex tables and grids. They give a vivid variety to the data, and they took on various subjects: education, colorism, economic class, and sometimes they would reproduce them twice, but with different visual structures. Also, the data sets are coming from different places. So in the Georgia Negro, it's all state-level data, both that the students and Du Bois gathered in person, but also state censuses. And then the second set is using national data. So this is the cover of the first plate. And it really sort of sets up the series. And his students open with this striking map that captures the sweeping nature of their study. You can see 2 circles connected by fine lines that track dark areas of Africa to equally dark swaths of the United States, Caribbean, and South America. There is a solitary white star that represents Georgia. in a wave of black ink. Though absent in the key, the gray zone suggests the migration of slaves beyond the most trafficked regions. Here and in many subsequent plates, the diagram is larger in scale than the text, while the written rhetoric matches the heaviness of its subject matter. In fact, there's this whole statement where he's making a case. It says, this case is devoted to a series of charts, maps, and other devices, which sounds kind of cool, like other devices. And thinking about the exhibition, it feels very technically advanced. It's sort of like touching a touch screen kind of thing, and would have seemed very futuristic at the time. And then has that quote of the color line. And this set, it's not multiples. Each one of these posters was a one-off. So there's only one set that lives in the Library of Congress. And you can see the level of detail and complexity. It just kind of amazes me that, untrained, sort of visually untrained folks created this. And there was actually, here's the other devices mention. There was actually an alumnus of Atlanta University, William Andrew Rogers, who is listed in publications as the point person, who would sort of be the art director, helping Du Bois execute these multiple teams of students. And because of the fast pace and because of the different hands across the set, you see a lot of typographic variation, even though it's still quite systematic. And so the cover of the second series, which is plate number 37, really to me, it looks like a manifesto. Designed as this kind of proclamation in type and image form. It's one of the most dense panels. You see some of that self-referential language that I mentioned earlier about the students at Atlanta University. Also, you see this color palette being expressed here of gouache and bright colors that continues from the Georgia study. And there's this strategic mix of typographic families and styles. The principal type here appears to be a sans serif or grotesque typeface, which predates the 20th century, but on closer inspection, it actually reveals that the predominant letter style used in the charts has no curves, only straight lines, and is more akin to lettering generated by templates for architectural or engineering plans. And based on the author's training in sociology rather than graphic design, it would make sense for the Atlanta University students to have used some pre-existing templates or tools. And in fact, I was with Rob at the Letterform Archive earlier today looking at a similar template setup. It's from later, from 1950, and it's Swedish, but it was sort of plastic jigs of straight lines and curves that would allow you to make letter forms, as well as a handbook that would show you how to do it. And so I imagine part of what they're doing is this very DIY, self-taught way of making lettering. And you can see this because in the lighter weights especially, the hand-rendered type utilized for the French translations, they were really thinking about this being a global audience, reading in English and French. You see this, the diacritic marks are much heavier, right? The template was probably American or maybe British and didn't have accents in that way. So they also have to do a lot of making their own punctuation, which you see across the set, and including these very crazy symbols. It's whoa. So this is a chart, this is an area chart of slaves and free Negroes. That's ink and watercolor. And it just look at this, and I almost kind of just have to pause for a second because it's just so intense to look at. Made a decade before the rise of dominant European avant-garde movements, these works predate modular design elements often considered to have their origins in Russian constructivism, De Style, and Italian futurism. And if you zoom in, there's this intentionality to the design, equating slavery with this kind of tear, when I was first looking, I was like, did they have too much coffee? Like, that's what my, Jan Baker would always say that with our gouache studies and RISD in our type class, oh. But no, it's like this very, sort of poetic layer on top of the data, and this use of Pan-African colors. Du Bois was one of the founders of the Pan-African Congress that would have actually, it met in London in 1900, that he would have gone on his way to or from the World's Fair. This is a chart for about Negro teachers in public schools. So there's also a rhetoric to the data sets he's choosing. We're public servants and teachers, we are the same as you. And the minimalism, the geometric modularity of these forms, this really looks like, Kandinsky's color test, right? This idea of using abstract shapes like circles, triangles, and rectangles, and bright primary colors are black and white, feels very novel for a 1900 design. And when I look at this, all I can think about is this. That's 1925, 26, Herbert Bayer's proof sheet for his universal alphabet. This idea of using a modular set of forms to create meaning for efficiency, which is quite similar to the template technology. This is assessed valuation of all taxable property owned by Georgian Negroes. This is 20 years before the founding of the Bauhaus, a German art and design school famous for rigorous foundation, in part using these kind of modular formal elements to create compositions. And just the expressiveness that's here, this looks like a bullseye, for target practice, and the intentional use of texture and color as a kind of compositional strategy to make your eye dive into it. And I imagine that Du Bois is learned, he's not working in a vacuum. He would have known about the charts of William Playfair, who is the Scottish statistician who created the pie chart. And so I imagine in his various degrees in education, he's probably looking at something like this. This is a statistical representation of the United States of America from 1805. Playfair made the first pie chart in 1801. And I think he would also, Du Bois and his team, probably known about Florence Nightingale. This is her rose diagram from 1859. Florence Nightingale, if you're not familiar with her, was a nurse and also a social activist, and she was very interested in collecting data about wounded soldiers in the Crimean War in England. And her statistical studies combined with the text of writer Harriet Martineau was able to convince the British government to increase funding to medical services for soldiers in the war. And so this idea of coupling infographic form to social change has case studies before Du Bois. Even this, look at this. This is literally bags of money. Value of land owned by Georgia Negroes, burlap bags. So, when I think of this, I'm thinking of isotype, right? This is foreshadowing critical developments in the history of data visualization, including simplified pictographic form. And this is not in Tufte. Tufte has 4 books. This doesn't appear anywhere in that. Tufte, where's Du Bois? I want to have a conference. I want to take his workshop just so I can have a conversation with him about this. I can give him my book, and he can give me his 4 books. And then you have these comparative sets. So this is about colorism and skin tone, which is so working with a design cliche, but looking at black, brown, and yellow Negroes. And so looking at this relationship between class and skin color, and Du Bois is this northern, freeborn, lighter skin educated scholar would have sort of a deep sensitivity of this, especially like collaborating with Booker T. Washington. You can see the detail, like, look at that, like blood red and the 40%. And so that's in the Georgia study, and then the same data but national, this is the design in the second study. So like this is a total different configuration of data. Also, you're starting to see different typography. So suddenly in the second set, they're also using letterpress in addition to the templates. I think they were running out of time. and they were like, okay, we gotta get this done. And Rob and I were talking today, and they probably did a letterpress proof, a one-off, and then did the diagram drawing on top, and they were like, well, there's got to be some consistency. So you see some of the template typography showing up across both sets. But then you have like other outliers like this, which has like almost all letterpress, and then just like a little bit of the template in the numbers. Because maybe, I don't know, they didn't have numbers for in the letterpress, or they're just moving fast. But it's amazing how like this looks like a Mondrian or like a color field painting from mid-century, and you can see this like with the diacritic marks. There's even some very oddball pieces of typography where they're just, I don't know, improvising, or maybe someone who has nice handwriting is doing this like this marking up of this impact between, this chart is about increase of white and Negro population related to slave trade, European immigration, and emancipation. And so it has this like weird, I don't know, maybe the type West students could classify what that type is for me. And then the small caps happening here. And I'm just like, this is so beautiful. Like he and the team are innovating. Like this is a chart type that doesn't exist or didn't exist before. I call this the Du Boisian spiral. And it's a line chart, a bar chart, excuse me, and a pie chart together, And so some of this is also like running out of, like, is this just what fit, And these are pretty big. They're 22 inches by 28 inches. So there's this kind of like, probably thinking about distance too. Like we think about a poster having a payoff to come over to the exhibit and turn the page, and like, I can't get Josef Müller-Brockmann out of my head when I see this, right? Like 55 years before that. So, just seeing, this kind of thing, or like seeing, Bayer again, it's just like really incredible how prescient this work was. And, there are so many different chart types to look at. There's geographic maps that use this heat map, things that use a lot of the principles you see in Tufte's research about information design. Color is a form of hierarchy, right? And using tones and tints where your eye is drawn, the most dense population is the darkest, or the brightest color. And like, there's just things, I don't even know how to qualify this. like, what do you call this? It's so rad. Attention to detail, type on a curve. The type West students who've done calligraphy, that's hard, right? Illiteracy, this is like stair-stepped, woven chart. And then the last plate I'll show is this, which really could have been made in like Illustrator or InDesign, right? There's multiple colors in tints and tones, photographic prints, gold seal, multiple grids and levels of hierarchy that are guiding the reading. And then at the bottom, for further statistics, raise the frame. And a lot of the plates, they use the back, so they had like the charts, the actual math from looking at a household income, in this case, of various occupations and mapping them to color. So I just want to serve up a little dessert now that you've had a full meal. And so I want to go back to the year 2000 and talk about my own design history and how this work, this research that I've done with Du Bois could have potential impacts in other ways. So I'm sort of thinking of my history teachers. There is the Doug Silverfox Scott, who still teaches design history at RISD. Like all of the sophomores, we had a crush on him. Really smart and like brilliant. Or Lorraine Fierce-Wild at CalArts, who has an amazing design history curriculum. And then I sort of think about their teachers or things that would influence them. So, 83 Meg's book, we have multiple editions of that. Both Doug and Lorraine were educated at Yale, so they have like American designers like Paul Rand, not really a historian, but just thinking about the influences, or Bradbury Thompson. I know Lorraine also did a lot of scholarship into the European emigres that were her faculty members. And I'm sure, she knew Lou Danziger, who created the first history of graphic design curriculum at CalArts, one of the first ones, and also taught at Art Center, and also her teacher at Cranbrook, Kathy McCoy. But I'm like, where am I in this picture? I don't really see myself here in certain ways. And part of that model is this very linear model, right? Design is a timeline, a modernist celebrity clothesline, right? And we start with, cuneiform. We got all the movements, we got the medieval period in typography. We have Kay's the Last Cow before that, Art Nouveau, yada, 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 and you barely get to the 80s. There's April Greiman, part of her, And so I was thinking, what are other models? Could you make your own family? Could you have a family of choice? Could we see design history as a series of connections, like Herbert Bayer and Walter Gropius? Could we see Joseph Mueller-Brockman and Max Bill as contemporaries, working in the same era, and then that's sort of like your family? Or Carl Gerstner and Armin Hoffman as colleagues, so a kind of graphic design string theory, right? I could also add Du Bois over there, right? I can choose him. But maybe we could actually have more of a reframing where there's sort of a major and minor history where once you have Du Bois, that reframes all these things that come after it. So, what is considered a major discourse and what's considered a minor discourse, and is that up for debate? And you could do that, and you could apply that to a whole design curriculum, right? So what I did with Du Bois, you could add to streamlining human factors, Norman Bell Geddes, Henry Dreyfuss, and then suddenly you add the Green Book, the Victor Hugo motorist Green Book, and suddenly this idea of automobile utopia is not available to all people in America. And so what about Robert Moses and sort of the BQE, or the destruction of Overtown through highways? In the 60s, too, you have you have the Eames Lounger, comes out in 68, or Eames chair is part of the aluminum group. And then you have also the I am a man sign. So you have people reclining, chilling in chairs at the same time people are, marching in refuse for their lives and for their jobs. So this idea of having a more expanded way of looking at design history is something I'm very much interested in, and hope this is sort of the beginning of and already is bigger conversations. And I think that's interesting to sort of end with this, what are the contemporary impacts of this kind of work? How can we use history as a case study? One of the things that I just want to share, because there's type designers in the room, or people learning to be type design, is the slides are typeset in a revival of, it's a beta of Du Bois's Type, and it's designed by Trey Seals, who runs Vocal Type. This is his website right now. And so he's made a bunch of different specimens based on Du Bois' work, including a light, a back italic. There's back slant type in some of the posters. I didn't show that. As well as italic and condensed. He's working on small caps. It's pretty amazing. So this idea that we can use history to make something that's contemporary and use it for contemporary uses. This is work of students that I worked with in a 5-day workshop in Philadelphia. And they took, Du Bois lived in Philadelphia and actually did a study before the Georgia Negro called the Philadelphia Negro. And so the students made this microsite that included their own research, particularly about segregation and race, but other kinds of diversity or other color lines that are existing in the city. And so different students either wrote narratives about what was happening in Philadelphia, which is one of the most diverse cities, but also the fourth most segregated city. They were looking at different demographics, per capita income, educational attainment, poverty, also things that are more class-oriented. This idea of changes in household income, which is really scary when you look at some of these districts, and this is 1960s, adjusted for inflation. So you have huge swings in some of these zip codes, going from 65 to 37, ouch. And then the other way around too, there are like bumps as well, but it's really some of these, it's really kind of like, whoa, that's a big change. So that you can look at phillyraceandsegregation.com if you want to look more at that. Also, Du Bois is showing up in contemporary art. These are the works of Theaster Gates, where he's abstracted the panels, which I think is fascinating. He's taken all the information out of it in a way, and kind of elevating Du Bois into the world of contemporary art, saying like, oh, this is like a monochrome, and renaming them. These are silk screen on aluminum. Here's a gallery view of them. So beautiful. I'm like, why didn't I think of that? Shit. And also in neon. It's just like, whoa, so cool. Right? Amazing. Amazing. So I would like to end with a quote to take away with you, which is James Baldwin. And it's from a article published in Ebony in 1965. It's called White Man's Guilt. He says, "White man, hear me. History, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read. It does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways. And history is literally present in all that we do. It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. And it is with great pain and terror that one begins to realize this. In great pain and terror, one begins to assess the history which has placed one where one is and formed one's point of view. In great pain and terror, because therefore one enters into a battle with that historical creation, oneself, and attempts to recreate oneself according to a principle more humane and more liberating. One begins the attempt to achieve a level of personal maturity and freedom which robs history of its tyrannical power and also changes history." Thank you so much.
I wonder if we know how much of the design of the infographics was to get the attention of the visitor, and how much of it was to represent the data. Do we know enough about like what their goals were with these really radical and colorful designs?
I think part of it was about like, hey, good to see you again. making something dynamic visually, and I think the abstraction was a way for him to circumvent the sort of typical diorama approach. I think he had already done a lot of charts in the Philadelphia study and had published those, and so I think he knew the power of visualized data. But because they're in a display, I mean, it's a World's Fair, right? Like, you have a lot of things that are very visually drawing your eye, and it's a spectacle. And so I think he knew with like the constraints of the budget, right? He's like, how do I actually address this issue in a way that people can understand and that can impact them? And so I think color and shape was very much a part of his thought behind it. And there's actually correspondence with him to the Library of Congress after the international domestic tour, where he's like, can you please send these back to me? Because I'm not done with them, you know? They didn't make him back to him, but I think he was really thinking about both. Great question.
I see a couple questions over here. Mm-hmm. Keep those hands up. Keep them up. Okay, I got him first.
This is great presentation. Thank you so much for this.
Welcome.
I've read a lot of his works and when I was an undergraduate and then over the years, but I never knew about these. Why is it that this, I don't remember any other individuals referring to this work, because the gravity and the weight of this visually is so compelling. At times I want to go back to his writings on this, and I think sometimes this has more weight to what he was talking about in his essays and the souls of Black folks than anything else. And I'm just finding out about these now.
Yeah, part of there's a couple parts to that. Great question. One is there's only one copy of them, so they weren't a multiple. So I think that's a big reason why they kind of disappeared when they weren't being seen anymore, because people didn't have copies of them. And there was no publication really of them except for photographs in the Colored American. I'm really curious, more research needs to be done about if there was any press reception in Europe. I'm super curious, like, were people writing about them, or like Kandinsky was 19, he's the oldest of the Bauhaus masters. I don't know, did he go to Paris and see this little corner of the American Pavilion? The other thing, second part, it has to do with his sociology, and not only were the diagrams erased, but his contribution to sociology has been silenced and erased by other sociologists. And you have this, especially the Chicago School of Sociologists, right? It's sort of known to be more like where it started. Alden Morris, who also wrote an essay, he wrote a book called The Scholar Denied, which are all the ways in which Du Bois and his sociology was erased by his white counterparts in the field and ignored. And I imagine, because this is sort of like also an outlier within that body of work, that this would have been sort of silenced and ignored as well.
Okay, let's do, I think we actually had this one, that one.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I'm Pino Trogo from San Francisco State. I have a question about the aesthetics versus how effective some of the charts are. And because I know, for example, you didn't actually show these ones.
Oh,
These are some colored maps where what the color range is from certain color to other colors, and then they go from dark to light. So this one, right? Because this is really wrong, right? It should be from dark colors to light colors. I love a lot of his stuff. Like I love the ribbons that turn, etc. So I think he has some great inventions that could be used today. And a fellow named Bertin points this out. So also you mentioned isotype. And and so I just wanted to add the same thing there in that big book that they published. They don't really talk about how effective they were. I mean, they pretty much take for granted that they are effective. So how do you see that?
Well, I mean, I think this is like a sign of they're not trained designers, right? Like they didn't take a color course. So they're just kind of doing something systematic that seems to make sense. And there are all kinds of interesting irregularities and very grassroots methods.
But what I just want to say is there's a tendency to try to not talk about
Yeah.
Because Nordic isotype is amazing, but the little man in a row.
Well, yeah, but also do you see, I mean, there's also a lot of colonialism in the isotype. I mean, do you see the figures? I mean, what the fuck? Sorry, hold on a second. What is that? This is like China with like straw hats on it, or there's sombreros in Latin America. That's isotype. What is that? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm just saying that this is never the question, although I think that, some things are missing, labels and all that.
Right.
So I think,
Yeah, that might be like, that might be the work of cognitive scientists, like, and if you want like empirical, doing comprehension tests or eye movement tracking on things, if you want to really get gritty like that. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Okay, over here.
I too want to thank you for a tremendous presentation. I have the book. I haven't really cracked it. It's on a stack of things to be read at home. But I wanted in your presentation, I'm curious a little bit about the history of the history-making process of the mural. Like, for example, who were his students? Is it known?
Yeah, there are records. That's how we found Andrew Rogers.
Okay.
There's in the Du Bois papers, there was a lot of publication, like alumni notes and things like that, and then also there was press coverage of the exhibition back in the States, and that's where we found text about him working on the plates. So you can actually, and Du Bois was a very meticulous documenter, and with the sociology, they published a lot of volumes and volumes of studies. In Black Reconstruction, in his bibliography, he goes where he's like, basically like historians that are racist, and then he's like sympathetic historians, and then he's like Negro historians, and then he's like young Negro dissertations. So he's really thinking. He did amass an archive of who was operating, who was doing what, and was very transparent about that. Yeah, good question.
Oh, hi. Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, knowing that the intended audience of this series was like bourgeois, white people abroad, how do you think that influenced the choices of data he chose to present, the subject matter, so on?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely he was very calculating. I mean, there's the one that looks like or I think looks like a Joseph Mueller Brockman. That was about household and kitchen furniture. So there's very domestic, sets of data that are being chosen, or even this idea of illiteracy. I think that's very calculated. And there's actually another chart that shows illiteracy rates. It's in the second set in the United States versus other countries in Europe. So he's in people of color, the rates in illiteracy are lower than some of these European countries. So he's being very specific and somewhat political, in some of the data, but also the first plate is okay, here's transatlantic slave trade, So that I think the abstraction was a choice of let's be rational, right? It's sort of using that kind of Enlightenment thing.
Was mentioned in the creation of the project, or that you found in creating your book about the visual direction this was taken, other than just trying to stand out in the fair setting? Yeah,
I didn't design the book. Ben, who works at Princeton Architectural Press, designed it. It was a budget thing. But I would have loved to design that book, but I think he did a great job. But you're right, you get the Neuland, you know what I mean? Rob Jim Pietro has an amazing article called Stereotypography, where he breaks down this sort of sans serif kind of black, not black letter, but black letter inspired typeface that gets associated with blackness, and all the Zora Neale Hurston, literature covers are in that type, or the Afro sheen, or so I think there is that, but it's interesting because that type is not designed until after these.
Right.
So even that reference is coming later. And it was interesting because Neuland, in Rob's article, he talks about it. It was like a poster typeface. It was about like being read from a distance. So like right now I'm also trying to think about like, I think we're doing a symposium at the ICA in Richmond, this show called Great Force, where we use the Du Bois types in exhibition design. And we're talking about the type. And I think there's this sort of discussion of racial profiling, potentially, that you could think about in your argument, like this idea of like surface read, you know, reading from a distance and sort of like making assumptions about like, you know, print as property, or like these kind of ways in which there is a kind of othering and I think exoticizing, you know, that is in that visual language you're talking about. And here Du Bois is sort of just saying like, well, we're sociologists. Like this is data, this is logic, we're human beings. Like we may have a different skin color, but you know, this is pure data. Like that's the rhetoric I think he's making. Yeah, great question.
Okay, there we go. Probably have time for one or two more.
Thank you for the presentation. Similar type of question in terms of data collection and the citizen statistics or the citizen statistician type of, you know, field work, data collection, the whole, you know, block and tackle of numbers and gathering, and some obviously from the census, but I'm assuming some was from actual field work, maybe interviews and so on. Could you talk a little bit about how that developed post this work, or to your knowledge or your insight?
I would like lean on Eldon Morris, you know, and like Britt and Whitney more to that, because that's sort of more their expertise. You know, I'm coming to this as a visual maker, and you know, I've worked with data sets and done information design, but you know, I'm not a data scientist, nor am I, you know, a sociologist. But there's a guy named Jason Forrest, who has done a blog series. He is a data scientist, like information visualization person who, and I don't know how he got away with this because I haven't seen one in person, but he talked the Library of Congress into showing him one of the plates in person, which I was like, oh, so jealous, because they're like wood pulp paper with inherent vice, like they're falling apart. Like you have to like trade your like right hand to see them. But he does a little bit more scholarship about like the sociology, and I think Morris also does sort of talks about that like over his career too, and how he uses strategy of like being in the street. And really, the Philadelphia Negro is like the first, I think, instance, if you look at Morris's writing, of kind of like this kind of urban sociology, you know, like sociology in the city. Yeah.
Okay, no more questions. Thank you so much, Silas.
Thank you.